You caught yourself sympathizing with Joe Goldberg while you were watching You, didn't you? If you did, then that means the writers of the show did their jobs well. Because as we watch throughout the show, we see it from his perspective, with his narration attempting to justify the things he's doing. And he's not just trying to convince himself, he's trying to convince us too. A lot of the time it works, as many people even idolize Joe when he is the villain of his own story. He has a traumatic childhood that the show fed us scraps of. We know he killed his abusive father to protect his mother, after which his mother abandoned him and started a new family, leaving Joe to float around in the system and eventually end up at Mr. Mooney's bookstore, where he went through more trauma of the harsh parenting of Mr. Mooney, doing things such as locking Joe in the same cage that he will later go on to lock his own victims in. Regardless, his childhood doesn't excuse his own actions, as he had many opportunities throughout the show to change his ways, but instead he chose to get worse as the show progresses. You isn't about a man seeking love by all means necessary. It's about a man feeling inadequate with himself and searching for someone he can mold into his own perfect fantasy to try to accept who he is. He does terrible things as the audience watches, but the majority of people who watch don't hate him, because he wasn't written to be hated. He was written to charm the audience, the same way he charms his own victims. In this video, we will view the way Joe evolves from the very first season when the mask is secure to the final season where that same mask has long since fallen. In season 1, Joe already had violent and obsessive tendencies that he justified for love. There's the mystery of the entire season of what happened to Candace, and it's heavily implied that Joe killed her and made it look like she just disappeared. But as we find out in season 2, she survived. We're going to go more in detail of the plot for season 1 than when we look at the other seasons, because we are primarily analyzing Joe as a character. Whenever Joe encounters Guinevere Beck for the first time, who will later haunt the narrative for the rest of the series, he begins doing what he does best and making assumptions about Beck and crafting his own version of her in his head, all because she made a few literature references and mildly flirted with him. His own perfect fantasy that's going to disappoint him. He thought that by stalking Beck that he would know her, but it wasn't really her. It was what he wanted her to be. He would watch Beck from her window on several occasions, even, you know. Anyways, Joe inserts himself while watching Beck whenever she's drunk and falls onto the train tracks, and he gets her a cab home. While they're in the cab, she's vulnerable. Joe takes her cell phone so that he can watch what she's doing and learn more about her. Not at all socially acceptable. He also breaks in her apartment to learn more about her, and he takes some creepy souvenirs such as her underwear. When Joe and her first meet, Beck is dating a guy named Benji, a trust fund baby and want-to-be entrepreneur. He is just enough of a douchebag for Joe to want to take him out of the picture, so Joe pretends to be someone interested in Benji's soda business and then traps him in his glass cage in the basement of the bookstore, and then puts peanut oil in Benji's coffee later on, killing him by allergic reaction, and burns his body. But before Joe made his decision, he seemed to be opposed to killing a man, which is interesting because we find out later that this isn't the first time that he's killed someone. He killed his father, and he killed Elijah after discovering Candace was cheating on him. During season 1, Joe does a good job at hiding his dark tendencies. However, Peach sees right through it, and also sees Joe as an opponent once he starts dating Beck, because she herself is also obsessed with Beck. Peach sees right through Joe, and I always like it when a movie or TV show has a character like this that sees something off about the main character. It keeps me on my toes and wondering what's coming next. Peach wants Beck to go with her to Paris, and Joe sees Peach as another obstacle the same way that Benji was. Joe kills Peach and makes it look like a suicide, doing whatever it takes for quote-unquote love. After this, there are ups and downs in Joe and Beck's relationship, and eventually they break up, and Joe gets with Karen for a short time. Joe was actually acting like a normal guy until he cheats on Karen with Beck, and then they get back together. Then Joe suspects that Beck is cheating on him with her therapist, Dr. Nikki, and it turns out she really was. Joe and Beck were able to move past this until Paco tells Beck that Joe told him the ceiling tiles are a good place to hide stuff, which I understand why he said this to Paco, but still, it's so suspicious. Beck looks in the ceiling tile of the bathroom and finds Joe's serial killer box of trophies and memoir. After this, Joe throws her in the cage and eventually kills her by strangulation. Joe finishes Beck's book and publishes it, framing Dr. Nikki as her killer. Joe did a lot of bad stuff already in only season 1, and it's only going to get worse as we go on. To summarize season 1 Joe, he tries to justify his actions that he seems to genuinely think are okay. From the beginning, it's obvious that he is an obsessive, stalking sociopath, and in this season, Joe is still trying to mask his evil from the characters in a cast that he picked. But we see his thoughts. We know that he's bad, but we still enjoy watching him, because he's justifying his actions through all his narration to himself and to us. And we get invested in what Joe is doing. That doesn't mean we're wrong for doing so, because it's impossible to not feel some sort of attachment to the main character. We know he's wrong, and we know he's a bad guy, or at least I hope everyone who watched knew from the beginning, but we still feel that attachment. Season 1 ends off on a cliffhanger, because to Joe's surprise, Candace is still alive, and she wants revenge. Season 2 is interesting to me because at some points it feels like Joe wants to turn over a new leaf and to be better, or at least he says he does, but this is only because of his new obsession and my favorite character from from the series Love Quinn. New season, new scenery, new love interest. Joe's now in LA under the identity of Will Bettelheim, who was the man who was going to get Joe a new identity, but then he ended up locking Will in his cage instead. And for the first and only time in the show, someone who gets locked in Joe's cage talks their way out of it. And in later seasons, we see Joe and Will are still in touch. This is an interesting addition to Joe's choices because it makes the viewer feel like Joe really is ready to change and be a better man for love. The entire season is pretty much a game of cat and mouse between Candace and Joe. Joe keeps it together pretty well this season, only killing Jasper, who is implied to be some sort of Russian mob boss, and Henderson, who is a predator. And let's be real, Joe killing a predator is nowhere near as bad as his actions in season 1. So we as the viewer were led to believe maybe Joe is actually turning over a new leaf. Joe did still have his stalking and obsessive tendencies this season, but nonetheless, he didn't do anything worse than he already has. I'm not going to go super in depth on the details of this season, as the purpose of this video is to look at the meaning of the story as a whole and the mental deterioration of Joe Goldberg. But there is one scene in particular I'd like to talk about, and that's whenever Love's brother 40 slips Joe LSD to help both of them work on the script and really tap into their creative tendencies. And 40 ends up dissecting Beck's book and figuring out the entire events of season 1. He was so geeked that he solved the entire case. But anyways, back to it. At one point, towards the end of the story, Joe finds Delilah, his landlord slash sneaky link, dead in his cage. And he doesn't remember killing her, so it's a mystery sequence while Joe is tripping trying to find out what happened to Delilah. In the finale, whenever Candace tries to expose who Joe really is to Love, Joe seemed to accept his fate and take accountability for his crimes. But Love kills Candace and reveals that she was the one who killed Delilah because she loved Joe. I feel like this single scene reversed all of Joe's progress in this season, because in the following season he acts exactly the same. But either way, I was losing my mind when the reveal came to who Love really was. I loved season 2 because of her, and it introduced me to my celebrity crush. But anywho, Joe was going to kill Love, which was insane because she showed him the same obsession that he showed. But then she reveals that she's pregnant with their child, so Joe doesn't kill Love and actually marries her, and they move to a quiet town called Madre Linda to raise their child. Joe's got everything he ever wanted: a wife, a child, a quiet life. But no, in the final episode it shows Joe stalking and obsessing over his neighbor, Natalie, because Joe can't change his ways, because the point of what the show is trying to show us is not love. It's Joe's obsession and entitlement to women. Joe is just a misogynistic man pretending to be a romantic intellect. On my first watch of the show, season 3 was at the bottom of my ranking, but revisiting it, I can't help but love it. It's a slower season, but it does a good job of putting you in the world and making you feel like you're there. This season, Joe is obsessed with not only one, but 2 women. First, Natalie Engler, who Love finds out about and kills, then Marianne, who Love was planning to kill in the season finale but changed her mind and decided to attempt to kill Joe. Marianne is also one of the only ones to see through Joe's charming act and run when she found out what Joe was. This season is another one of Joe's calmer arcs, and the focus is mostly on Love since it's her last season, and I think that may be what made me favor it. Just because it was a calmer season for Joe doesn't mean he's good by any means necessary. He still stalks Natalie and Marianne, cheats on his wife, helps his wife hide bodies, practically hunts Carrie and Sherry, and then locks them in the cage in the basement of the bakery. Joe also kills Ryan for Marianne so that she can get custody of her daughter, kills his wife, and abandons his son so that he can chase Marianne to Paris. He did all of these things with no problem, but Joe's mental state in this season was an interesting one to me because he's going through a victim complex of having a problem with these misdeeds when they involve Love and treating her like a psychopath when she kills for him, but has no problem when he kills for Marianne. And this is because Love isn't a damsel in distress like the fantasy Joe wants. Love is impulsive and doesn't need to be saved. Unlike Joe, Love embraces and accepts who she is instead of trying to mask it. Towards the end of the season, when Theo finds Sherry and Carrie locked in the basement of the bakery and Love realizes she can't let him leave, she hits him in the head with a fire extinguisher, wounding him, and Joe finds him and actually saves him. I felt like this showed a glimmer of hope in Joe, that he saved him when he could have just let him die. That's the thing about the way Joe's character is written. He does just enough things that are good-natured that it makes us question him morally. In season 1, that was Joe looking out for Paco. In season 2, he looked out for Ellie. Some may think he does it out of a good place, but I think that's the point, to trick us into seeing something more than a murderous sociopath to his character. I think in actuality, the real reason he does these things is to convince himself that he is a good person, and does the things he does because he has to. But that's not at all the case. He could have settled down with Love and his son, but he didn't. He wanted to continue doing what he has always done. By the end of season 3, he is still trying to convince himself he is good, but what happens when he stops trying to convince himself? We start season 4 in a new place, being Paris, which I've noticed is a common theme for every season of the show. New location, new obsession, new characters, and Joe under a new identity, Professor Jonathan Moore. I really enjoyed the whole whodidit murder mystery vibe the season had, and then the plot twist that Joe was the Eat the Rich killer, and the whole time he was trying to figure out who was sending him clues and ominous text messages, only for it to turn out to be in his head, and he was the one doing it. At this point in the series, Joe is at an all-time low mentally. He's literally disassociating and hallucinating the entire season, and the writers finally begin portraying him as the monster he's been the whole time. Joe, as Jonathan Moore, lets Marianne go when he realizes she wants nothing to do with him, and befriends a group of higher-up rich people. But as we know from the plot twist later on in the season, he has a split personality, and this personality is pretty much all of Joe's negative qualities. It's his dark side in the form of Reese Montrose. It turned out Joe didn't let Marianne go. He locked her in a cage, and he had been slowly picking people off in his new friend group. The main focus of the season is on the mystery and Joe's growing insanity, but he does have a new obsession, Kate Lockwood, daughter of billionaire Tom Lockwood, who by the end of the season he ends up marrying. Joe did do some of the worst things yet in the season, and he didn't even know it, but just because he didn't know it doesn't mean it wasn't there. That was just the true him. Once he realizes what's going on with him, he teams up with the hallucination of his dark side, Reese, and kills Kate's father, who, to be fair, deserved it. I mean, the guy probably killed more people indirectly than Joe did. For the main staple of Joe's mental health this season, he confronts his dark side and seems to truly want to leave his past behind and die a changed man, and attempts to do what he thinks best and throw himself off a bridge so he doesn't hurt any more people, but he is unfortunately rescued. Quick side note about Kate, she had a past of doing messed up stuff while working for her father, doing a business deal that gave several children cancer. In the ending scene, Kate and Joe tell each other that they will leave their dark sides behind and hold each other accountable moving forward. And this season, Joe gets a happy ending, which he didn't deserve. Kate scrubs his record clean, he's got all the money in the world he can ask for, he takes his son back from Dante. He's in a position where he has a final chance to change moving forward and leave it all behind. One last fresh start. But of course, this isn't going to happen because he's shown time and time again that he doesn't really want to change. It's actually the opposite. To me, he seems to have a deep hidden desire to want to be worse. By season 5, the final season, Joe has completely lost any morals he may have had in previous seasons. He is married to Kate and is heavily under the eye of the public as a celebrity, and people love him and view him as a perfect man. He's the media's golden boy. In this season, Kate actually asks Joe to kill Uncle Bob because he was a liability and was feeding reporters scraps of information about Kate giving kids cancer. Joe kills him and makes it look like a suicide with no questions asked, like he had been waiting for it, and after, he seems eager to kill again. There's also a less important storyline of Joe living out his fantasies of killing people through his writing, which I feel like was worth mentioning. Due to Reagan wanting to take over the Lockwood Company, Joe attempts to capture her, but mistakenly captures her twin sister Maddie. And to solve this problem, he decides to then capture the real Reagan, throw her in the cage with Maddie, and tell Reagan that to be released, she'll have to kill her own twin sister. Joe does this because he has to have something on Maddie to let her out. But still, that is beyond morally questionable because it's a problem that he created out of his urges to kill someone for convenience. To me, his dialogue doesn't even seem to be troubled about it. He seems more mildly inconvenienced, like any other day-to-day problem. He becomes obsessed with Bronte, who, unbeknownst to Joe, is actually a former friend of Beck's looking to bring him down. He kills Clayton in front of several people and on camera, thinking he is protecting Bronte from an abusive ex-boyfriend. Now the media is torn between accusing Joe of his past deeds and rumors about him being true, and the other half believes it was in self-defense. And then another fraction of people not caring either way and idolizing his actions in the name of quote-unquote love. Joe does several things to try to win the public over, such as going on a live stream to gain sympathy. But none of that matters because in his final showdown with Kate, Nadia, and Marianne, Joe admits on a voice note several of his crimes, and it is sent to the law enforcement. By the end of the season, Joe thinks he is running away with Bronte to live happily ever after and avoid incarceration, and he is still playing the victim and trying to act misunderstood when at this point in the story, it's blatantly obvious who he really is. But Bronte is planning on betraying Joe and bringing him down. They squat in an empty house, and Joe is still upholding the mask to Bronte of being in love with her and her being at the center of his universe. But right when things are starting to get intimate, Bronte pulls out a gun on an almost naked Joe, in just his boxers, and she confronts him at gunpoint and demands Joe to tell her how he killed Beck. Joe is still trying to manipulate his way out of the situation, calling his victims crazy and telling Bronte she should be too smart to fall for that. But unluckily for him, Bronte sees him clearly now for who he is. A monster and a sexual predator, if we're being honest. And in the scenes before Joe is arrested, when we aren't hearing Joe's narration, we can see that and see how truly scary he is. Like the sequence whenever Joe is running up from the yard to the house that Bronte is in. It was literal nightmare fuel. But in these scenes, we see the point I've been pushing the entire entire video. When the narration and the charming dialogue is taken away, he really is just a misogynistic murdering sociopath that wants to be the author in the lives of his victims and write them the way he fantasizes about them, and then kill them when it doesn't go his way. By the end of the season, we see Joe with the mask completely off. As the viewer, we are no longer blinded by the fantasy of a man who will do anything for love. We're shown the reality of a terrible man. In the end, Joe is sent to prison and reads fan letter smut that was sent to him of women still fantasizing about a man like him. And this shows us that the story wasn't following the crumbling of Joe's mental health. It was about us as the viewer getting charmed by Joe the same way all of his victims were, even though we saw everything he did. We knew from the very beginning what Joe was, but we still chose to ignore it. This isn't a review video, but I would still like to add the fact that I think the ending of this show and the message it sent was perfect. Not only is he the problem, but idolizing a man like him adds to the problem. And the final scene when he's lying in the prison cell and reading the fan letter while a distorted Creep by Radiohead was playing, it was absolutely incredible in my opinion. I think he got the ending he deserved, to be alone for the rest of his life. Joe Goldberg never actually had a mental decline. That was simply his mask slipping and finally falling off by the end. He didn't change or evolve throughout the entire show. He just chose what to show us, and we believed him. And like I stated in the beginning, he was never written to be hated. He was written to be loved so that he would deceive us too. Joe Goldberg was simply just a sociopath confusing obsession and entitlement for true love. The way we see him in the season 5 finale should have been the way we saw him the entire time. That's all I've got for today, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe to see more, and let me know what you guys want me to go over next, and I'll do my best. I love y'all. Peace.